my whole family was a family of storytellers. They would never say that to you if you asked them, are you a cuentista, are you a storyteller? They would just shrug, because I think that's just how they move through the world. I think when you lose your country the way that they did, they used story, I think, to feel better, to remind themselves of who they had been in Cuba, to remind themselves of family and good times. But the most important thing I think they did for me is that they used story to connect me to who I was, to who my family was before we were here. So Abuela Bena was the best one of all. Now, she only went to school until the 8th grade or so. In Cuba, she rolled cigars for a living. She was a very humble person. Her children, my mother, my aunts, they were the first generation that went to university, but Abuela Bena had not. So when I met her in Queens, she was my babysitter after school, and I would come home and I'd find her watching Lucha Libre on TV. And you know, she was not a person who had good filters about what should kids watch, what stories should we share with children. So we'd watch Lucha Libre and I'd say, Abuela, is this really happening? As people were banging chairs over each other. And she'd go, what a crazy question, of course it's happening, it's real. And she was just delightful that way. And then she'd sit down and she'd tell me stories, and they weren't the stories, I'm pretty sure, that my American friends were getting from their grandparents. So Abuela Bena would say, I'll tell you the story. And one time she told me the story of the hurricane of 1933. My Tia Isa had been born that year. She was an infant, and this terrible storm came through Cuba and basically wiped out their whole village. And the memory I have is Abuela Bena under this cloud of smoke saying to me, I could still smell the dead on my streets, and things that would really scare somebody who's 7. But it just transported me. And then there were just all kinds of stories, little stories about the parks in Sagua La Grande and the beautiful Spanish architecture, and how you'd sit on the porch waiting for the ice cream man to come through, and the mangoes and the chickens. And it was all so far away from my life in Queens. You know, I had brick, I had cement, I had the city, which had its own beauty, but it wasn't a tropical island. It wasn't sugary sand under my toes. It wasn't the river rushing behind your house. Nothing like that. But I love those stories because they were so sensory, but also because they were like a ribbon connecting me to who I was. And I think kids need to know who they were, who their parents were, especially if they're growing up here and their parents were from elsewhere. Because sometimes we get the idea here that this is all there is, that this is the right way to live, that this is the only way to live. And that's not true. And there are beautiful things from the places that we come from and the things we left behind. Even if we left behind in difficult circumstances, there were things to love about there. There were things that made an imprint on our parents and that in some way can make imprint on us. So when I think of my grandmother as the cuentista and the stories that they told me, I'm just so grateful that she gave me that time.